Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I was merely catching up on my reading with a few stories to die for. Now that we have reached the month of October, what better way to manufacture some spooks, scares, and goosebumps than a look at the master of suspense himself, Sir Alfred Hitchcock. We will begin our 2-week tribute to the master with a truly terrifying look at the director's worst films. Thank you. Happy October, horror movie fans! I thought what better way to look at horror movies this October than to start with the master of suspense, Alfred Hitchcock. Back when COVID-19 hit and I didn't have to go into a physical school and teach anymore, one thing I did was I watched my way through every Billy Wilder film. And I enjoyed that so much I did it again with the 45 sound films directed by Alfred Hitchcock. The 44 in English, plus Mary, which is in German. And I watched them in order, and when I was all done, I sat down and ranked them. Because Hitchcock's work, his body of films, is so diverse, with films of all different genres and styles and types, not just horror and suspense and spy thrillers like we usually associate him with. And everybody has different favorites and least favorites, so I thought, well, instead of doing some huge video where I talk about all 45, because that would be 10 hours long, I thought, why don't I look at my bottom 5 and my top 5. Now, one of the main messages of my channel, Betamax Blocker, is positivity, so we'll try to look for things that we like even in these bottom 5, and please do comment below if you've seen any of these, if you're familiar with any of them, because some of them are kind of obscure, and please do put your favorite Hitchcocks below, because next week we'll look at the top 5. I should add before we begin, I didn't watch any of his silent films for this. I don't actually have The Pleasure Garden, his very first movie. It's never been made legitimately available in the US that I'm aware of. So I skipped over the silents, just so you know they won't be there. Instead we'll pick up from 1929's Blackmail, 1976's Family Plot. Here are my bottom 5 films by Alfred Hitchcock. Coming in at the top of the bottom of my list at number 41 of 45, 1934's Waltzes from Vienna. I bought this DVD on Amazon, but I don't think it's entirely legitimate. Starry Night Home Media tends to release things that are kind of in a gray, public domain-ish area. But anyway, Waltzes from Vienna is sometimes regarded as Hitchcock's worst film, even by the director himself, with him famously saying it was the lowest ebb of his career. A film he made just to keep busy, just to have something to do, not because he was actually interested in the project. Now there's debate as to whether or not he actually meant it was his worst, or just the one he was least interested in, or perhaps least proud of. Waltzes from Vienna tells the story of Johann Strauss Jr. writing the famous Blue Danube Waltz, and how he's met with constant resistance from lack of money, to his disapproving father, to his attempts to win the beautiful baker's daughter, played by Jessie Matthews. So, not a very Hitchcockian story, very much a pedestrian romantic story. There's a very telling statement about this movie by Hitchcock himself, I believe in his interview with Francois Truffaut, where he called it a musical without music. And that is so telling. Waltzes from Vienna has lots of setups for musical numbers, like all the servants parading through the big anteroom in the mansion, but there's no actual songs in it besides the Blue Danube Waltz, but that's an instrumental, and there's still action going on while the music is playing. So, I'm not necessarily opposed to a movie like this on the surface, but the problem is Hitchcock took a musical and made it a not musical. If you want to see the actual musical version of the story, here's Julien Duvevay's The Great Waltz, which is a much better film, and shows that, Duvevay cared a lot more about the subject than Hitchcock did, because this feels every bit like a movie that was just phoned in. Hitchcock did it because he had to. He also clashed a lot with Jessie Matthews, who plays the female lead. Admittedly, she's not very good in this. It looks like from the credits and from the publicity materials, they went through some time and expense to obtain her for the movie, but she just comes off as whiny and kind of like the 1930s equivalent of Regina George. You know, someone that, why would a man give up his career for this woman who complains all the time? I don't know. It's further compounded by Esmond Knight in the lead. Knight, of course, would pop up in all kinds of post-World War II movies like Black Narcissus. He's probably more famous for those. But he had played the role on stage, but he's completely detached here. And apparently both he and Matthews fought with Hitchcock so much that it kind of made production miserable. So maybe everybody acts so lackadaisical just because they want to get through the stupid thing. So we have a dull plot that's probably not what it should be. We have two leads who can't, make it work. They have no chemistry together. The behind-the-scenes drama was probably trickling in front of the camera and whatnot. So why do Waltzes from Vienna reach number 41? Well, it does have one thing working for it, and that's a very strong supporting cast, headed by Edmund Gwenn, Kris Kringle himself. He would later, of course, win an Oscar for this movie, Miracle on 34th Street. He worked with Hitchcock 4 different times, including on Foreign Correspondent, Trouble with Harry, and The Skin Game being the others, playing a very different role each time too, but Gwenn's performance as Johann Strauss Sr. is quite good. He does an excellent job. He's, bullish and mean, but he's also subject to flattery, and those scenes work pretty well. And the real highlight is Frank Bosper as the Count, who is playing kind of this manic, comical part, which injects some much-needed energy into the movie, because most of the other performances are so sluggish. It's interesting to see him in a pure comedy part with slapstick and bombast, because, of course, he played Ramon the Hitman in the 1930s version, The Man Who Knew Too Much. Kind of like a proto-James Bond character, very debonair and suave and charming, but also a ruthless killer. So it's fun to see him in a kind of a buffoon role here. But Waltzes from Vienna, pretty skippable. Maybe if Hitchcock had adapted it musically, that could have worked better, or I think with different actors and actresses cast in the leads, I think it could have been something better. But as it stands, it's just an interesting curio, and it's one of several films Hitchcock made that if you scratched his name off and wrote someone else's on in its place, I would not know. There's very little in terms of Hitchcockian touch here. Coming up next on the list, in a similar vein, Hitchcock's 1931 comedy Rich and Strange, which I don't believe has been fully restored, and if it has, it's only been made available in the UK or other parts of Europe, not in the United States. So sadly, this crappy public domain copy is all I've got to work with for my watch through and whatnot. But Rich and Strange is kind of a weird comedy, and again, not a movie that feels especially Hitchcockian. So two young British people, a young couple, receive a big inheritance and decide to travel the world. The big problem I have with Rich and Strange is that it wants to be a fun globe-trotting comedy like Around the World in 80 Days or something, but there's no budget here. So we're left with a lot of stock footage and weird montages, and it kind of makes me sad to watch it. A movie I watched recently was The Story of Mankind from the 50s, and I just felt sad because the people making it thought it was such a big, beautiful spectacle, and it wasn't. It was so depressing how little they had to work with. And this movie feels much the same way. Apparently there was a lot more stuff filmed that was cut. Henry Kendall, the leading actor in his book, talked about filming a lot of scenes in water, in a tank and whatnot, that were eventually cut, which he was mad about because they were such a pain to make. But Rich and Strange feels kind of like Hitchcock saw some of those early mid-30s romantic comedies from America, movies like Ambassador Bill or Ruggles of Red Gap, which depicted Americans going to Europe and kind of upending these ancient European traditions with some folksy American wisdom and whatnot. And he looked at those and said, well, I can do that. Have a British couple go abroad and, figure out who they are and how they impact other people and whatnot. But it really just comes off as kind of pedestrian, much like Waltzes from Vienna. There are some good gags in here, including one involving a cat, which is probably the main thing this film is remembered for. It is both hilarious and absolutely disgusting at the same time. One of his best, I think, kind of dark comedy jokes. But Rich and Strange just feels dull. The leads don't have a ton of chemistry, the supporting cast isn't that great. Again, the movie feels very cheap and very superficial. And I think if Hitchcock had had a bigger budget, he probably could have made something out of it. It also, weirdly enough, relies very heavily on a lot of silent movie tools like title cards and things like that. Hitchcock made his first sound film, Blackmail, in both sound and silent form. After that, it was strictly sound. But this one has a lot of silent movie elements. I really noticed it on my last watch there. It was kind of strange. Rich and strange. And in the end, it's not like a bad watch, nor is Waltz's from Vienna, but it certainly isn't anything spectacular. It's kind of disappointing in a way. But if you want to check it out, you know, I can't say, hey, don't watch Waltz's from Vienna, Rich and Strange, you'll be wasting your time, because they're not terrible, they're just kind of bland. The next three, though, are absolute slogs to sit through. Jumping ahead much farther in Hitchcock's career, 1968 spy thriller Topaz. Topaz had a very complicated production and release history with different edits of the film being released in different countries. It has 3 alternate endings, one of which completely changes the outcome of the film. All 3 of them are released, available on most US releases anyway, like this one from the Masterpiece Collection. I think this kind of explains a lot of the issues with Topaz, because the movie itself is so oddly structured and badly paced that it feels like no one quite knew what they wanted to do with this. Topaz is based on a novel by Leon Uris, known of course for his giant historical books there, like here's Trinity, and its follow-up Redemption, both of which are excellent books. A much shorter book of his, Topaz, talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and also a Soviet agent working out of the French embassy in Washington to smuggle information about U.S. Installations and whatnot to the Soviets, that kind of thing. And so a French Secret Service agent, played by Frederick Stafford in the film, is tasked with figuring out who this man is and making sure that he is brought to justice. Who is the undercover operative? And in that, there's definitely a potential for a good movie, but Topaz is so strange. It feels almost like a TV miniseries. The beginning, it opens with a pretty good action scene, admittedly, but then the beginning introduces certain characters, sets a lot of stuff up, but then about halfway through it shifts gears. We have all these new characters, others, like the characters we met at the very beginning, completely disappear, and we're left with this really confusing mess. A lot of reviews dismiss Topaz as being boring, and that's very fair because there's way too much plot, there's way too many characters, and a big focus in the book that Hitchcock and company seemed to want to bring into the movie was the kind of personal issues of this agent, Andre Devereaux, played by, again, Frederick Stafford. And I like in the book, and it is done somewhat in the film, he's a young man, prematurely aged by this high-stress, high-stakes job. It's hurting his marriage. He can't really trust his friends because he doesn't know who is actually his friend and who's an enemy, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of potential there, you know, so that being a secret agent, being a spy would be extremely tough on a person and would be a miserable, lonely life. And Hitchcock had toyed with that idea before in movies like Secret Agent. So, you know, again, Topaz on paper sounds like it should have worked, but the bizarre structure with the complete plot shift and whatnot doesn't help it. The fact that Stafford doesn't really have great chemistry with a lot of his co-stars is a problem. I mean, Hitchcock had tried to avoid casting any major US or British stars. The closest we get is John Forsythe, who remarked how much different it was working with Hitchcock on this film versus a decade earlier when he'd been on Hitchcock's TV show and he'd done The Trouble with Harry with him, that Hitchcock was just kind of like out of it through the whole shooting, and it shows. It doesn't come off as a cohesive, intelligent movie. It comes off as a lot of individual scenes. I think as a mini-series, as, you know, 2 or 3 big chunks, kind of watch them in order, it could actually work pretty well. But as it stands, it's so badly paced and structured. A poor cast. It is neat to see John Vernon and Roscoe Lee Browne in kind of early roles. But again, just the production stuff. Hitchcock does have a fun cameo. You can kind of see on the back of the VHS there. But I was disappointed, and just bored, too. For a movie that is, at least in most edits in the US, about 2 hours and 20 minutes long, there's only a handful of action scenes. And the main villain, Michael Piccoli as Jacques Granville, really doesn't do much of anything. We're not even really sure he's the main villain. Way too many characters. You know, a definite misfire, and although Hitchcock had been making spy thrillers for 30 years at that point, this one he seems to kind of have lost his touch. If you've watched some of my other movie videos, you know that occasionally I go off on early sound films. If you watch my Oscar video from last Oscar season, Talked about the Broadway Melody, which is a fun film to watch, but definitely a relic of its time. If you watch my rare VHS series, I did one on Disraeli, a film that is let down by its supporting cast, because while George Arliss is actually quite good, as is his wife, everyone else still imagines they're on stage, shouting their lines and gesturing wildly and making absolute fools of themselves. And that carries over to my one from the bottom pick for Hitchcock, and boom, back to the public domain set here. 1930s Juno and the Paycock. Based on the classic Irish play, Juno and the Paycock tells the story of a poor Irish tenement family, beleaguered by problems, who all of a sudden has a big windfall. They can afford fancy stuff and new furniture and whatnot, and the complications that ensue. It almost kind of reminds me of like Parasite or something today, in the sense that talks about class differences and social differences and economic issues, that kind of thing. So it's a good premise, and I like that Hitchcock picked a play to adapt that probably was pretty controversial for its time. There's themes in here, unwed motherhood. There's a lot about the IRA and about like post-traumatic stress and whatnot. The big problem with Juno and the Paycock is, just like Disraeli, it's the acting, with one exception, which I'll get to in a moment. Almost every cast member is taking this extremely serious material and yelling it, or repeating their lines again and again, or making the weirdest faces the whole time. Everyone is playing to the back row, they're mugging, they're hamming. It's absolutely absurd, and it undercuts any sense of drama. There is so much yelling in this movie, you would never believe it. And it doesn't really need to be that way. Hitchcock's first sound film, Blackmail, ranked about number 21 for me. I really like Blackmail, more than a lot of other Hitchcock fans seem to. But Blackmail felt, for the most part, pretty modern. The acting was subdued. Hitchcock used sound tactfully. He has a few very clever scenes, using kind of, balancing sound and silence, as a lot of early films from that time did. Juno and the Paycock is definitely an attempt to film the play. It's very stagey, which is okay. Hitchcock had done kind of stagey, claustrophobic films before. Lifeboat, Rope, of course, that kind of thing. But here, again, the acting is just so absurd. There are a couple highlights. Barry Fitzgerald, who had apparently played the major role, the Paycock, or Peacock as we would say in America, on stage, has a little bit of a role as a rabble-rouser at the beginning of the film, and his little cameo is fun. And Sarah Allgood, who would pop up a decade later in How Green Was My Valley, the story of Welsh coal miners, playing a very similar part, actually. She is really good in this, too. In fact, she's so good, it kind of hurts the film because everyone else is so awful. She delivers her lines naturally, and they shout their replies and gesture and everything. It's just like, oh my gosh, really? So it's a shame. This great Irish play that could have been very thought-provoking and whatnot, instead, it is just a big can of ham. So what's my last pick? What's my bottom Hitchcock film going to be? The popular opinion is usually Jamaica Inn from 1939. Maureen O'Hara, in her book *Tis Herself*, writes a lot about the production of this movie, and it's fascinating how Charles Laughton basically took over and, bulldozed Hitchcock every chance he had, and Hitchcock didn't care. He just wanted to finish up and move to Hollywood because he had a contract waiting there, so he let Laughton do what he wanted. But Jamaica Inn is, I think, at least a fun watch. This is the restored version, which is much better. All the missing scenes are put back in, and I can have a good enough time with it. It ranked at number 40 on my list. It's a fun swashbuckler. Nothing great, but certainly watchable. Number 39 on my list, another one that's often hated, Hitchcock's romantic comedy, Mr. and Mrs. Smith from 1941. I believe Carole Lombard's final film, which is a shame because her and Robert Montgomery are perfect in this, and they could absolutely have done multiple films together, and they would have been quite good. Mr. and Mrs. Smith has some really funny gags, especially when they go to the pizzeria where they went on their first date, and it's not only extremely unwelcoming, but also highly unsanitary, relatable issue there. But the problem is Hitchcock's direction is way too heavy-handed. This was better for someone like Leo McCarey, who had done a few of those, We're Kind of Married but Kind of Not comedies that were very popular in the late 30s and early 40s. It's not unwatchable, it's got some great gags, it's just way too long and way too slow-paced to really work. Maybe for my bottom pick, I'll give you a hot take. Maybe I'll say it's Psycho, or Vertigo, or Rear Window. But nope, not a hot take. Let's take a look at my pick for Hitchcock's worst feature film. Coming in at the very bottom at number 45 of 45, from 1949, Under Capricorn. I cannot get into Under Capricorn. In Ingrid Bergman's book, My Story, she writes about how this was initially conceived as the Australian equivalent to Gone with the Wind. This multi-hour, full-color epic shot on location in Australia that would tell this beautiful story about Australia in the 1820s and 1830s when it was moving from being a prison colony to being its own, civilization, that sort of thing. And that's a really strong idea for a film. I like that. But the problem is, Under Capricorn, it doesn't go anywhere. It's way too long, and it builds really to nothing. The more Hitchcock got involved, the more he knocked down things like going to Australia to film, the more he kind of shortened it up and wanted to make it more, I guess, of a thriller, mystery, suspense film. But the problem is there's very little in terms of thrills, mystery, or suspense. Ingrid Bergman plays much the same role she had played to great success in 1944's Gaslight, directed by George Cukor, and she played a similar part for Hitchcock in his wonderful 1946 movie Notorious. She's the woman who's being manipulated by those around her into either believing she's ill or actually becoming ill in order to, get something. In this case, it's Margaret Leighton as the maid who is kind of forcing her into this position so she can run away with Bergman's husband, Sam, played by Joseph Cotten. Now, I love Joseph Cotten. He's a great actor. He's in one of my favorite movies, The Third Man. He's very good in that. He was Holly Martin's himself. I can see him on the back of the box there. Cotten did not want to do Under Capricorn, and indeed he is the one to whom its derogatory nickname Under Corny Crap is often attributed. Hitchcock could not get him enthusiastic about the project, and it shows. He looks like he does not want to be there. Bergman's okay. Michael Wilding kind of rounds out the trio there, and he's not really very good either. He once said how silly it was to have an American, a Swedish person, and an English person all play Australians. And that kind of shows too. The three don't really have a lot of chemistry together, and the scenes are all so talky. It feels like it should be building to a big confrontation or a big element of suspense, but it doesn't. It doesn't build to much of anything. There is a cool shrunken head prop that's used for the film's kind of one, thriller moment. But even then, it's just, there's not much to it. It comes off as very pedestrian and very dull. Hitchcock was no doubt trying to capitalize on the popularity of Rope. Rope, of course, was done in long takes to make it look like it had occurred in real time. And he tinkers with that here. He doesn't really commit to it. Apparently that gave the actors some difficulty, and no one was too keen on that. So it's only used kind of off and on throughout the movie. And it gives it very much a play-like style, kind of like Juno and the Paycock. Feels like a filmed play. And that doesn't help this movie. Something about this old-timey Australian setting, it should be big and broad and, outdoors and whatnot, not something that's cooped up and claustrophobic. Very strange. He also was trying to capitalize on 1940's Rebecca, which had won the Best Picture Oscar. And Rebecca, being someone who's completely foreign to a place, pushed into this other culture. And Rebecca works really well with this young woman, pushed into this very traditional English high society. So here it could work as well. An Englishman arrives in Australia and, has to learn all the rules about this new society. It's very interesting. And there are some really cool facts about like how convicts had to have certain papers in order to get jobs after their terms were up, and, your old employer or whatever could lord that over you and deny you your papers if he didn't want you to leave, that kind of thing. It's really interesting, but nothing much is done with any of this, and it's not even worked into the framework of the story. I kept thinking of the movie Jezebel with Bette Davis, where, all these customs of the old American South are explained and worked into the story. Under Capricorn doesn't do that. They're just kind of dumped in these expository lumps and various points, and I can't get into that. I will say I like watching it on VHS because the color is kind of washed out and it gives it an old-timey feel. And again, Millie the Maid is an interesting villain, no doubt kind of trying to channel Mrs. Danvers, Judith Anderson's Mrs. Danvers from Rebecca, but not really given the screen time or the material, to do that. In the end, it just comes off as dull and boring and way too long, and the fact that everyone involved seemed to be having a miserable time just kind of shows. Definitely skippable. It does have its fans. In fact, all Hitchcock films have their fans, but this is my pick for his least good film. So, please share your least favorite Hitchcocks or even your favorite Hitchcocks below. I'll be back next week to talk about my top 5. Until then, my friends, go out there and do something ghoulish for Halloween. We'll catch you later.